Well, first of all, the whole notion of fake news is not a new phenomenon. One of the sayings about a lie traveling around the world before the truth laces up its shoes actually can be traced to Jonathan Swift, probably in 1710, writing in the London Examiner, and he said, falsehood flies and truth comes limping after it. And so this has been with us for quite a while. The reality, though, of so-called artificial intelligence is actually something that a lot of news organizations have been developing to good effect for a considerable period. And at Bloomberg, for example, we are now able to detect, for example, insider trading, which is, you could argue, a public service, by using algorithms to discern unusual trading patterns, which is a data-driven exercise. And that's just one example of how one goes about using technology and data together to serve the public interest. That's relatively recent, but if you go back to when we started, we were able to do the same thing with, for example, economic reporting. We could figure out with any information, for example, whether it's gross domestic product or industrial production, any number of pieces of data that are important to investors, we could figure out what people were expecting, whether the number that would be reported would be greater than expected, less than expected, or exactly what they're looking for, and could craft a computer-driven story, if you like, and this goes all the way back to 1990, really. Didn't have everything you want in it, but it got you a lot further along, and the result is that you could do smarter, faster, better reporting with the aid of technology. So I for one, and I don't think my colleagues at Bloomberg, or for that matter, my colleagues elsewhere, are particularly unnerved by the use of machines and technology in aiding reporting today.
In aiding, not replacing.
Well, you know, we're not as that wonderful presentation showed. We're not quite where we could say the human is no longer necessary. We still have a long way to go before we get to that point. Yeah. And I'm not sure, by the way, you know, when you could possibly get to that point, but I will tell you that right now, this is actually a great time to be a journalist because you have so much technological toolkits available to you that you can deploy, and it really makes for better reporting.
Mr. Baker, I just get back to you. I wanted to ask Mina, because Mina was whispering to me that you wanted to say something about what Nathaniel was saying.
Thanks, Ali. Well, I mean, just to follow on from that, first of all, we're already using elements of AI in our newsroom at the National. And so whether it's being able to mine the incredible amount of data out there at any given point, there's no journalist that I would get to spend hours at a time now, something that we can now do with thanks to artificial intelligence. So it's a welcome development, and it saved us time and is much more efficient. You know, and it's something like sports news. You no longer really wait for the scores, for your journalists to write up the scores, but it's the match reports that, you know, we beautifully curate and so forth. The second element I wanted to address was just, if we're talking about biases, yes, there is some unconscious bias, but a lot of bias in the news is conscious, and it's often related either to ownership and who your publisher is and what your ethos is. And I don't think using AI or not using AI actually even begins to scrape the surface of that issue. So I don't think that's the solution necessarily. And whether you're able to trace patterns, again, I think some of that is already out there and people are using it, but the reality is the bias is much more to do with politics and how much people can read. So my third point was really that today when we think about the news and how long we can keep people's attention, we can measure that, and that's amazing, and everything from how long people are spending on your homepage and how swiftly they're moving on to the next thing. And we're learning patterns about that. Part of it is we analyze it ourselves, and part of it we have programs that do the analyzing and let us know. So again, that's part of our day-to-day work today. But the element of how you're engaging your reader is, yes, data, but also still editors and coming together and thinking of news. And the news gathering is still going to be people on the ground picking up certain things. Yes, drones will pick up from the sky certain footage, but news gathering is still very much a human endeavor.
Mr. Baker, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much for hosting this. Well, you asked if we're worried. I'm very worried by what I heard. I'm very disturbed by this kind of talk, not for the reason you might think. I think there is not because I'm concerned about journalist jobs. I think there will continue to be significant dislocation, which will result in some journalists losing their jobs. But as Nathaniel said, others will do different jobs. What worries me enormously is and by the way, artificial intelligence, as the others have said, is also already at use in newsrooms. There are ways in which you can see it could be advanced into all kinds of news gathering, reporting, whether it, as has been mentioned, sports or economic data, or corporate reports. What really, really worries me is the idea that we would invest in the idea of objective truth as ascertained by artificial intelligence, that we would rely on algorithms to tell us, to settle the big issues, the big disputes that resolve around facts and factual interpretation in the world today. Nathaniel mentioned it, in his remarks, but he didn't elaborate on it, unfortunately. We have this phenomenon right now with search, in particular, particularly with Google, but any Google is the most important, obviously, because it's the largest. We have this phenomenon where Google would like you to believe that what they are doing when you enter a search for a particular, whatever it is you're looking for, that they are generating, because it's the algorithm, and the algorithm can't be challenged because it's the objective truth, that what they're producing is a perfect distillation of the truth. If you search for, you want to find out what happened in the Gulf yesterday, the top 10 news stories that Google News will find for you, that's supposed to be, and people unfortunately rely on that as kind of the truth, as the objective truth, because it's produced by their algorithm. But of course we know very well that what goes into the algorithm determines what comes out of it. And if Google News choose to rely on particular news sources for that information, then that's the information that will come out. I'm very worried that we already suffer in the media from perceptions, absolutely fair and accurate perceptions of bias. But people at least get right now that if one news organization is saying that Donald Trump is the worst president who's ever existed and a complete idiot and is going to lead the world to disaster, they understand that's a bunch of news editors expressing that view, and they get that's one view. And if another is saying actually Donald Trump is the salvation of the world and is making America great again, that's coming from another set of editors. This idea that news would somehow, we would all be somehow elevating to the status of absolutely unchallengeable objective truth because it's come from an algorithm which is sifting all the data and it's got more data than any human could possibly ever process. That just really worries me. And the same problem that we're facing with Google and Facebook choosing to select particular facts, news stories, items in their output, which is produced by the algorithm, and they defend themselves by saying, "Oh, it's just the algorithm. The algorithm is there just to discern the objective truth." That's not actually true. That's not true. You don't get the objective truth every time you do a Google search. You just don't. You get what their algorithm tells to present to you. So I really worry that this would actually accentuate and intensify the lack of trust that people already have in news, because they would actually be expected to believe that this was being produced by some machine which can't be wrong, whereas in fact it can actually be as wrong as the people who are producing the news right now.
That's a very good point. Thank you. When I saw Nathaniel, having his speech, and I kind of visualized probably Mark Zuckerberg's first announcement of, Facebook and connectivity and how the world will become a fascinating place, a much much more peaceful place. It is the salvation of to the world, connecting people, Google, having this abundance of information, YouTube, etc. And then disaster happened. And all of these ideals and ideas suddenly were reduced to fake news, post-truth, and that led actually to conflicts and wars and Brexits and elections and what have you. Are we now seeing a promise that will later on, when this promise sees the money, it will become something else? Mr. Mathew?
So I actually am pretty encouraged by how technology makes journalism better from our own experience. And I say that because just as automobiles today are essentially increasingly computers, and they're much safer because they have all kinds of sensors built into them that protect people from themselves, so too does the technology with respect to reporting and gathering information enable you to know a great deal more about any subject much faster and with greater scope than ever before. And this is evident, for example, when one is looking at a very complicated economic story that has multiple facets to it, lots of different kinds of data. And the only way to get at the story is to synthesize all of the data points that come across from the technology, and that enables you to essentially make relative value decisions. And that's really what journalists are supposed to do. Journalists are supposed to tell you, is something better or worse? Is it cheaper? Is it expensive? That sort of thing. And the technology that we have available to us enables us much more often to do that relative value analysis with much greater accuracy and precision. So I'm not trying to suggest that yet, as I said earlier, that the machine replaces the human. What I'm saying is that when they work together, when the human is using technology that is available, you can produce reporting narrative that is far more comprehensive and accurate than ever before.
Thank you. Mina, with the, I believe that journalism and being a newsman is a blessing because this is a noble job. It is a service to the people, it's a service to the truth, to humanity. Journalism is one of the really pillars of society. With all of this fake news era, alternative facts, and all of the Babel Electroni, there are really now new words that are being introduced to the English language that are scary. Is the noble value of journalism in danger? Is it really there? I mean, are we making a difference? Can we make a difference anymore?
I think we can make a difference because you see stories that are impactful, especially those that can genuinely change course of history. They come about very few in between, but they're very important. But the day-to-day service, the public service of informing people continues to be important. The fears that we have about fake news are tied into what we're saying about how quickly something can spread now, and what, to go back to the title of our session, what is viral and what can become viral. And a lot of that has to do more with money and how money is being funneled to, whether it's Google ads or other ways that people can actually start promoting. We've seen everything that Twitter has had to deal with Twitter trolls, farming of accounts that then promote a certain idea and so forth. And at the heart of it is about what can you trust, but also media literacy. One of the things that we need is to educate people about what source of news they're actually getting and where it's coming from. And it goes back to the other point that we were talking about, bias. So long as you educate people about who's the owner, what's the editorial lines that a particular publication goes, then you're doing the service to your readers to know. And that's not a new problem. I mean, that problem in terms of who's behind certain news organizations all over the world is one that's always been there, but people are becoming smarter about it. So in some way, it's about the education and the relationship building of trust, and the fact that people now are increasingly wanting to distill what information they're getting. I think we've turned a corner from where we were 5 or 3 years ago, where people felt overwhelmed with the information flow they're getting, and they're getting smarter. And it's really interesting to see increasingly, study after study shows that people will trust a news item that's been shared with them from their friends because they trust their friend, and they think if their friends read this, then they can trust it. Of course, that's not necessarily true, because quite often people are sharing stories they've only read the headline of and not read the rest of the story. But the idea is who's going to be your reference point, and that will change. And again, I'm excited about this era of journalism because I think we still do noble work, and we are forging the next era of journalism in terms of how you deal with all of this information.
Mr. Baker, you're a veteran journalist. You've been around quite a bit. Are you worried about the concept of telling truth? You know, we pride ourselves that we tell truth to power, and then power is coming back at us and say, no, this is not true.
Yeah, I am. Look, the challenge with truth is that there are different types of truth. I mean, there are obvious truths. There are easily verifiable and indeed falsifiable propositions. We can see, you know, if the stock market goes up 2.5% one day, that's verifiable. We can all agree on that. We can disagree perhaps on which index we're using, but we can see that if we agree on a particular index, that's easily verifiable, and if somebody produces something that isn't true, that's easily falsifiable. But what about the proposition? What about the question of why did the stock market go up 2.5% today? That is also susceptible, presumably, to an analysis that is designed to ascertain the truth. We want to know the truth. We want to know why the stock market went up 2.5%. The challenge with that is there probably is one truth that explains why the market went up 2.5%. But is anybody here really confident that they absolutely, even with all the data in the world, can give an absolute explanation, a true explanation for that? And again, what worries me about this idea that there is a single objective truth for everything that happens in the world, and that either humans, which has been the situation for a long time, or increasingly machines, can tell you what that truth is, troubles me because it is not, because there are many things that we need to know, that we need as informed citizens need to know, that we have to acknowledge that there is a level of uncertainty about, and there has to be an assignment of uncertainty, of certainty and uncertainty to those things, rather than simply saying this is true, that is true. If the government cuts taxes by the U.S. government cuts taxes by $1 trillion. What impact does that have on the economy? There are thousands and thousands of impacts it has on the economy. All of them can be investigated and can be more thoroughly investigated, I'm sure, by data. But the idea that there's a single true answer to that question is just false. And I think that we need to be very clear about that when this is the problem, and if I may just say so, there's a very comforting narrative that most of the media, the sort of traditional media, like to use, which is that up until about 1995, the news was perfect. It was all true. It was put together by very smart, capable, hard-working, diligent, authoritative reporters and editors. They put it out, whether it was New York Times or CNN or the BBC or broadcasters or newspapers around the world, and it was true. And then along came this really irritating thing called the internet, where everybody suddenly was able to put out all kinds of stuff, and goodness me, nobody could trust the New York Times anymore because there was other stuff competing with it. Well, that's just a false narrative. There were lots and lots and lots of things that were wrong with the media. There were lots of views about the media. There were lots of views that were implicit in what we were seeing as supposedly true, generally with a particular bias, generally in most of the West with a left-wing bias. And that's why we got alternative sources of news. Rupert Murdoch my ultimate boss always likes to tell a sort of funny line about how he founded Fox News. Fox News was founded in 1996, and he likes to joke, I founded Fox News because I thought there was a niche in the market. And he says it turns out the niche was 50%. And that's the problem. And this idea, again, that everything that the media told us for all time, and if only we could get back to those glory days when these bastions of truth could be trusted again, everything would be fine. That just isn't true. People came to understand that the authorized version that they were being told wasn't the whole truth. It wasn't necessarily lies. I'm not accusing news organization of lying, but any news organization makes selective judgments about what news to emphasize and what news to de-emphasize. And as it happened, those traditional news organizations emphasized news that seemed to fit the worldview of their editors and their reporters. And people came along and said, no, the world's a bit more complicated than that. Sorry.
So I think there's a good example.
Quickly, Mathew, yeah.
I want to give you a good example of where the narrative based on traditional reporting was misleading, to say the least, and the use of data was very effective in showing actually where things were headed. And let's go back to 2015, and much of the press, certainly in the developed world, was preoccupied with Greece. Just had a new government elected at the end of 2014, and the new government said, we're no longer accepting the terms that the European Union had put upon us. And the narrative progressively through the first 6 months of that year, 15, was that Greece, in the words of Alan Greenspan, would leave the euro in default, and George Soros on the other side, although they had the same conclusion, said Greece is going down the drain. Now, if you were paying attention to a lot of data, never mind what people were saying or writing or broadcasting in the first 6 months of the year, you would have seen that the yield on a 10-year tradable Greek government bond was well below the yield in 2012. In 2012, Greece was trading in the bond market at 30 cents on the dollar. That's how bad it was. By 2015, it was 70 cents. At no point in 2015 did that yield get below, really 70 cents. The point being that investors everywhere were very much paying attention to Greece and had come to the conclusion that the Greek people did not, and there was no poll that showed that they did, were going to return to the drachma, and that the Greek people really didn't want to leave the euro either, the European Union. And the result was, of course, despite a lot of noise, all through the first 6 months of 2015, if you were paying attention to data, which was accessible to enough people, certainly investors, you would have seen, by the way, that it was more noise than a signal. And in fact, if you looked at all the assets in 2015, art, real estate, debt, equity, Greek government bonds in 2015 had the highest return, about 180%.
Thank you. So data is important. Thank you very much for your presence here, gentlemen. It's been great, and lady, Mina, Mathew, and Gerard. It's been fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you very much.